Here we go. So Philippians chapter 2, the whole chapter is one that elevates the office of service. Now, we like to think of being served. We don't like to think so much of serving others. And if we do, we are often a little grumbly and a little complaining about it. But the whole chapter elevates the office of service. It demonstrates the worthiness of humble, selfless service as a critical part of anyone who wants to follow Jesus. Jesus came to serve, not to be served. So if we're going to follow him, we're going to have to follow in his footsteps of serving others rather than seeking to be served, rather than seeking to be catered to. We want to meet the needs of others. If we look at just kind of a brief summary of chapter 2 in Philippians, in verses 1 through 4 of the chapter, we see the call to disciples to submit themselves to communal understandings of service. What it means to live in a community of people who love one another, sacrifice for one another, pour themselves out for one another, and be expended for each other. In verses 5 through 11, Paul homes in on Jesus' demonstration of supreme humility, the way he served us all the way to the point of death. He shows us what it means to be last so that others could be saved through his sacrifice on the cross. Then in verses 12 and following, Paul tells the people to obey this example by demonstrating the veracity of their salvation by a working, humble faith. It's one thing to say that we have faith in Christ. It is another thing for that faith to be working out, to be demonstrating its veracity, its truthfulness, its vitality. That faith is a faith that works, and it demonstrates the person and work of Jesus in our lives as we humbly serve each other. And so in verses 12 and following, we see that we are encouraged to serve one another without complaining, without grumbling, and to show the worth of Jesus' example by emulating it. We see Jesus' example, and we don't simply praise God that he was like the way that he was, but instead we want to emulate that. We want to fall behind in his footsteps and follow him well. The example of Jesus in Philippians 2 is sandwiched between these calls for humble service. Serve, why? Because Jesus served all the way to the point of his death. Now obey this example and live in a like manner. All of this is a distinct and critical part of being a disciple. For a person who says, I am a disciple of Jesus, and yet they do not serve, I take issue with their confession. I take issue with the fact that they would say, I'm a disciple of Jesus, but yet I do not follow him. Because to be a disciple means to follow. And so we want to live out this aspect of what it means to be a disciple. Now, as we look at that summary of chapter 2, we begin to close out the chapter in verses 18 and following. And we close out the chapter by looking at a series of verses that show us three men. It's easy to look at Jesus and go, well, yeah, Jesus humbly served because he's God in the flesh. We could never do that. Well, then we see the evidence of the life of Paul, Timothy, and a man named Epaphroditus, who I might refer to as E for the rest of the service. There's 5 syllables in his name, and that's just ridiculous. So let's read the text beginning in actually verse 19 of chapter 2. Paul says, I hope in the Lord Jesus to send Timothy to you soon, so that I too may be cheered by news of you. For I have no one like him who will be genuinely concerned for your welfare. For they all seek their own interests, not those of Jesus Christ. But you know Timothy's proven worth, how as a son with a father he has served with me in the gospel. I hope therefore to send him just as soon as I see how it will go with me. And I trust in the Lord that shortly I myself will come also. I thought it necessary to send to you Epaphroditus, my brother and fellow worker and fellow soldier, and your messenger and minister to my need. For he's been longing for you all and has been distressed because you heard that he was ill. Indeed, he was ill, near to death, but God had mercy on him, and not only on him, but on me also, lest I should have sorrow upon sorrow. I am the more eager to send him, therefore, that you may rejoice at seeing him again, and that I may be less anxious. So receive him in the Lord with all joy and honor such men. For he nearly died for the work of Christ, risking his life to complete what was lacking in your service to me. So we see Paul, Timothy, and Epaphroditus in this text. What was the relationship of these two men, Timothy and E? What was their relationship to Paul? Well, Paul was the older mentor, and they were the younger disciples. They were the younger followers, the younger pupils, if you will, to Paul's mentoring responsibility. Paul is a disciple maker, and they are disciples. They've been so influenced by Paul over the years that they've come to embrace the very same things that Paul had embraced. Paul is the individual who was in the early parts of his life persecuting Christians and building fame because he was so excellent at doing his job. And one day on a trip, on a persecution trip, he was knocked off of his horse, saw a bright light, was encountered by the living, resurrected Jesus Christ, and was told that his life was forever going to change from this point on. And Paul, so enraptured with the gospel, so caught up in what it was that Jesus had done for him, that Jesus in his life had put Paul right with God through his perfect example, through his perfect living, and that through his death had died for all of Paul's sins, had put all of Paul's misdeeds and bad living, he had put all of those things to the side, had dealt with all of those things on the cross of Calvary, and then had been raised powerfully back to life. This message, this story had entranced Paul. He lived his life saturated and infatuated with the story of what Jesus had done for him in his life, his death, and his resurrection. And so Paul is a passionate individual who is attracting, like a magnet would attract metal, he's attracting other individuals to himself. They see something in his example that is radical, that is amazing. It evidences and shows that the work of Christ has truly set up in this man's heart. And so these two individuals, Timothy and E, were protégés of Paul. They see something in Paul worthy of emulating. They were individuals that Paul had sent out in times past, sent out on mission to accomplish a given task. Paul could send Timothy and E out knowing that sending them out was just as if he himself was going out. He had such confidence in them. The way he talks about Timothy, I know that no one else will be so concerned for your welfare. I know Timothy. I know his heart. I know his passion. He's been with me. He's watched me. He's learned this from me as I have sought to follow Jesus Christ. And now he's getting ready to send them out again to the Philippians, knowing that if they go, it's as if he is himself going. In this text, Paul gives us a paradigm for ministry built on the concept of replication. Paul is being replicated in Timothy and Epaphroditus. His passions, his love, his concern, his work ethic, everything that Paul is being replicated in Timothy and Epaphroditus. The fact that he is so caught up by and enraptured in the gospel, that is being replicated in these two men. Now, I don't mean, of course, that Timothy and E were just like Paul. They weren't. They were distinct individuals. They had their own personalities. They had their own gift sets. They were different individuals, but they had come to love the things that Paul had come to love. They had begun to be influenced and shaped by the same things that had shaped Paul. Just like Joshua was shaped by Moses, and just like Elisha was shaped by Elijah, Timothy and E were indelibly marked by the influence of Paul in their lives. Paul has been running hard after Jesus. And so these men are learning that by example, to run hard after Jesus, to follow the example that Christ has set, to follow in his steps. Now, the very idea of shaping others for the sake of the gospel and the fame of Jesus is a driving influence at the journey. If I was asked to reduce to the lowest common denominator what it is that we are so concerned about, what it is that we are so passionate about, I could simply reduce it all the way back to saying we want to help people form as disciples and learn to make disciples. That's the mission that the church is given. We can think of and list page after page after page of things that the church should be concerned about. And all of those things could be good influences, good shaping factors for the church. But if we lower it all the way down, we want to make disciples. We want for you to be disciples, and not only that, we want for you to make disciples. I think the mission of Jesus, as he gave it to his apostles before he ascended into heaven, was to make disciples who make disciples. You pass down what you've been taught. You pass down what you've heard. You pass down what you have seen with your very eyes so that it would shape other individuals and change their lives so that they would then be influencing and shaping other people. This idea is critical to the heartbeat of what we're called to do at the journey. Now, we fail at it. We fail at it often. We failed at many levels at helping to equip you as disciples learn how to make disciples of others. But it's still our heartbeat. We'll fail, but hopefully we're failing forward in so many ways. We're learning from our mistakes, learning from the things that we haven't done well, so that you can be equipped like Paul equipped Timothy and Epaphroditus. We want to equip you so that you can be men like Timothy and Epaphroditus. People who are sent out on mission to live out this great paradigm of salvation that was secured through Jesus Christ. The mission of the church is to make disciples and then send them out to make disciples. Very simply put, that's what we're about. We're not about children's programs. We're not even about a Sunday morning gathering where we can get together, sing songs, and hear a message. We're about making disciples. In this text, we see Paul's full confidence in these two men. He knows that sending them out will be opportunities for Christ. Paul had said at the end of chapter 1, for me to live is Christ. I think Paul could easily say as well, for Timothy to live is Christ. For Epaphroditus to live is Christ. For me to send them to you is an opportunity that Jesus will be ministered to you. He has that kind of confidence in these young men. And I want to be able to say, for Leah to go out is opportunity for Christ. For Tiago to go out is opportunity for Christ. For Aaron to go out is opportunity for Christ. That Jesus would do his work in the world through people that he has called out for himself. Paul has this confidence in these individuals, and I want to have that same confidence in all of us, that for us to live is opportunity for Christ. For us to live is that we have lost taste for everything but Jesus. Our only concern is that we might be united with him in the fellowship of his sufferings and the power of his resurrection. Timothy and Epaphroditus have followed Paul. They have been shaped by Paul. They have been influenced by Paul because he was so intentional in his relationship with them. He walked with them, talked with them, shared his meals with them, and now they're here ministering to his needs while he's incarcerated. While he's in jail, they're here now ministering to him when they could be off doing other things. I think this text gives us a wonderful model of critical importance. Your life is to be about shaping people. If you're a Christian, if you have given your heart to Jesus Christ, he has come in, he has forgiven you of your sin, he has attributed his righteousness to your account, his resurrection has now empowered you to live a new life, then your life is to be about shaping others. Now, if you're a parent, at least you could be able to say, that I see and understand this, this aspect of parenting. I should be shaping my children. In fact, the call to make disciples should be first fulfilled by a parent in the home with his children, before it's fulfilled in any other venue, whether where he works or the neighborhood he lives in or any other thing. Are you shaping your children as disciples? Are you influencing them so that they might follow Jesus? So it gives us this critical model that is so very important. So my question is, beyond your children, who are you intentionally shaping? Who are you intentionally shaping? Who are you intentionally leading towards Jesus? Do you have anyone in your life that you could send out on a specific mission because you have worked to prepare them for this task? And I mean a gospel mission. Do you have people that you could give a task of critical importance, and you'd have the kind of confidence in them that them going to fulfill the mission is just as good as you going to fulfill the mission, because you've worked so hard to equip them, and you've seen the evidence in their life that they'll do well in this? If you're not intentionally making disciples, we want to correct this. And I think if we're all honest, we probably have to admit that we're not intentionally and personally shaping very many other people in our lives. Can we be honest about that? We're self-absorbed. We're involved in a great many other things. We go to work, we make a living, we make the house payment, we mow the yard, we try to raise our children. We are incredibly busy with life. But the business of making disciples is quite often a very low priority for us. What we want to do in time, over a period of time, is to see people shaped so that we are moving towards Christ-likeness, and we are moving towards being able to disciple other people. We want to equip you for this work. Not only that, we want to hold you accountable to do it. We want to hold you accountable to do it. The church is an organism created by God, and one of its purposes is that it might hold us accountable to do the work that God has called us to do. So we don't only want to equip you, we want to equip you and hold you accountable to make disciples. Jody May, who's the pastor of the Journey in Dallas, has been working feverishly for months to design a process of discipleship that we would flesh out at the Journey churches, so that we would have a very intentional way about going, about equipping you for the work of shaping and influencing others, so that you can say, as a member at the Journey, you are growing as a disciple and as a disciple maker. That's what we want to be true about your life. We've recognized our failure on many levels to do the work of equipping you for this task. And we want to get it right. We want to get it right. It's not enough for us that you're simply growing in your walk with Jesus Christ. A lot of people will say, I'm growing in my walk with Jesus Christ, which can often be a synonym. It can often be a synonym for learning about Jesus without truly following the example of Jesus. To say that, oh, I'm growing in grace, I'm growing in my understanding of Jesus. It can often be a synonym to say that I'm learning things about God. I'm growing in my knowledge of the Bible, and yet it's not transforming me. It's not changing me. So it's not enough for us simply to help you grow in your walk with Christ. We have no interest in you simply knowing more. I have no interest as your pastor to simply help you to know more. My interest is that you would be transformed more. Is that the gospel would so saturate and permeate your life that you are being shaped and transformed by it. The way that Timothy and Epaphroditus were shaped and transformed by the message that they've heard and been taught. We want each of you to be like Paul in this text. We want for you to replicate yourself and your growing gospel passions in others so that not only you're sent out for mission, but you're also then sending others out for mission. They're involved with you, engaged with you in this great gospel mission of making disciples. And that's our hope for you, not that we would simply gather here and sing songs and hear a message on Sunday. Let me tell you, Sunday morning gatherings will not transform the world. For us to gather here and have this wonderful warmth of fellowship that we have, this will not transform the world. You becoming a portrait of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ where He's planted you will transform the world around you. To seek to apply the work of Jesus Christ, what He has done to put us right with His Father, that message, the gospel message, will begin to transform the lives of people around us. Many people will reject it. Many people will reject you and be rejecting Jesus in the process. But many people will hear and believe. Many people will be changed. Many marriages will be healed. Many broken homes will be restored. Many meth addicts will be healed. Many porn addicts will be healed through your influence, bringing the gospel to bear in all of the places that you find yourself. That's what will transform the world. You see, the gospel is the power of God to salvation, not a Sunday morning gathering. Sunday morning gatherings have not transformed the world. Our men's groups where we get together and talk about the Bible will not transform the world. Our women's groups where you do Bible studies will not transform the world. It's when we go out into the places that God has planted us with the gospel that we study in those Bible study groups. With the gospel that we're equipped with in worship on Sunday morning. That's what's going to transform the world around us. So we want you all to be like Paul in this text, to replicate yourself in others. Now I want us to take a closer look at the text so that we can see what it is exactly that has been replicated in Timothy and Epaphroditus. What is it about Paul that has been passed on? What is it about Paul? What is it in his DNA that has now been replicated in these two men? Well, the first thing I want you to see in chapter 2 in our text is that Paul's selflessness has been replicated in his protégés. Paul's selflessness has been replicated in his protégés. Look in verse 20. Paul says, "For I have no one like him," speaking of Timothy, "who will be genuinely concerned for your welfare." Paul says, Timothy is unlike anybody else I know because he is so concerned for other people. He has lived out what we see in, I think it's verse 4 of chapter 2. He says, "Let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others." Timothy's doing that. Timothy has found the interest of others as a prevailing way to live. And so he's giving himself, he's pouring himself out for other people, for their welfare. So they have learned in Paul, they've seen in Paul selflessness. And so it's been passed on. Look in verse 21. He says, "For they all seek their own interest." Paul's talking about so many other people who would claim the name of Jesus. They all seek their own interest, not those of Jesus Christ. But you know Timothy's proven worth. You've seen him. You've experienced in his ministry to you, as Timothy would have ministered to the Philippians with Paul in the past. You've seen in his ministry to you that he cares more about you than he does his own self. And then when we speak of Epaphroditus in verse 30, we see also that this selflessness has been passed on. Paul says, "For he nearly died for the work of Christ, risking his life to complete what was lacking in your service to me." Epaphroditus was so consumed by the gospel, he was so shaped by Paul's gospel influence in his life, that he's willing to risk his own life. Which of us are willing to risk our lives for the welfare of others beyond our immediate family? I think any of us could say, I would give my life for my child. Any one of my children right now, I would give my life so that my children could live. But which of us would say, I am willing to give my life so that my neighbors might come to know Jesus Christ? I am willing to give my life so that my coworkers who are far from God could come to know Jesus Christ. Epaphroditus is risking his own life. Paul's selflessness has been replicated in his protégés. They've learned this from Paul. They've seen Paul. In fact, I'm pretty sure that Timothy and Epaphroditus may have been there when Paul was beaten with 39 lashes at one of 5 different times in his life. They watched Paul have the skin flayed off his body with a whip. You see, they have learned what it looks like to give themselves up in real life manner. Not conceptual, not theoretical, but they've seen him beaten because of his love for others. We have to model and teach selflessness to those we disciple. If you're a parent, you should be intentionally teaching your children to think more about others than they do themselves. And that's a battle, isn't it? That's a battle. A real challenge. I don't know of anything more difficult because our children are born with a depraved indifference to others. They are born with a depraved indifference towards others. They want what they want, and they don't care what it costs anybody else to get it. They don't care how it affects anybody. We don't have to teach that to our children. They get it natural. It's just easy for them to be like that. The Bible says in the book of Proverbs that rebellion is bound up in the heart of a child, and we could say that this rebellious indifference to others is bound up in the heart of a child. And it's the job of the parent to drive it far from him with the rod of discipline. You have to be more determined to drive this rebellious indifference out of the heart of your children than they are to hold on to it. You have to be more determined than they are. We drive out rebellion through determined discipline. Now, discipline is a rod of correction. It absolutely is, as Proverbs suggests, but it's more than that. It's also an example as well as clear, intentional instruction. Every time you make dinner for your children, when you help them to wash clothes, when you help them to clean their bedroom, any way that you serve your children, fathers, when you go out and you make a living to pay the bills so that your children can live under a roof and have good meals to eat, we should be explaining to them continually that God is teaching us how to care more about them than we do ourselves. Give them reason for why you do the things that you do so that they can begin to learn, like Timothy learned from Paul, they can begin to learn that you are more concerned for them than you are yourself. Make disciples of your children. Make disciples of your children. I think quite often we expect that our children just get it, right? They watch us and they just get it. Now, example is a wonderful thing, but example without intentional, clear instruction falls short. It does. If we instruct our children clearly and they see that we flesh it out through example, then they will begin to get it. It will begin to shape them and change them. So be so determined to make disciples of your children that you're willing to drive rebellious indifference to others out of their hearts. It will be a never-ending battle, but one that you must be devoted to if you're going to mentor your children in the way of Christ. And as you begin or continue to disciple others beyond your children, you must be intentional about teaching selfless service. This means you model it. You model it. As I said earlier, Timothy and Epaphroditus learned this from Paul. They learned this from Paul. Timothy probably saw it in his grandmother and his mother as well, who were influenced in his life. But they saw and were continually inspired by the selfless giving of Paul. They'd been there and they'd watched him give himself up for others. The very act of discipling another is a giving of oneself for the equipping of another. So long as your motives are driven by the gospel and not a motive of promoting yourself, then you will be shaping those that you influence in a very positive way. And the second thing that was replicated from Paul to Timothy and Epaphroditus is his concern for others. Just his pure concern for others. Paul's concern has been replicated in his proteges. Look in verse 20 of chapter 2. For I have no one else like him who will be genuinely concerned for your welfare. Genuinely concerned for your welfare. His passion is for you. The passion of Epaphroditus is for others. In verse 26 of chapter 2, we see this about Epaphroditus. For he's been longing for you all and has been distressed because you heard that he was ill. He doesn't even like it. Epaphroditus doesn't like it that the Philippians know he's ill because he knows they'll be overly concerned for him. And he would rather them not be caught up or bound up with that at all. His service and his concern is so completely and distinctly for them. You see, a protege will learn to love what you love. They will learn to be concerned about the things that you are concerned about. If someone were following you, if someone were seeking to be influenced by you continually, what would they be evidencing in their life? Would you see in those people, if they were mirroring your image, if they were mirroring the things that you're concerned about, would you see in them an intense concern for other people? Or would you see a good amount of self-absorption if they were mirroring your image? Timothy and Epaphroditus have watched Paul in fits of longing for others. They've watched his tears hit the floor as he groans over the sins and trials of people that he deeply cares about and loves. They've seen the lengths that he's willing to go to bring the gospel to those who need it. They've seen Paul's concern. So if people were watching our lives, if they were being influenced by us, would we see concern for others as a driving passion in their lives? Is that true of you? Is concern for others a driving passion in your lives? Is concern for your neighbors who do not know Jesus Christ a driving passion in your lives? You're concerned for your coworkers. You're concerned for those that you recreate with. Do you grieve in longing for these people to know Christ? Timothy and Epaphroditus have learned this from Paul. They've learned it from Paul. Jesus' passion for others was clearly seen and replicated in his disciples. They loved the world so much. We can look at John 3:16, right, and say, for God so loved the world that he sent his only begotten Son. We can read other texts in the New Testament that talk about Jesus' longing and concern for others. And these things have been passed down into his disciples. And so they loved the world so much that they gave themselves sacrificially, risking all of their lives, following his example and dying to take the gospel to unreached people groups. Matthew was killed by the sword in Ethiopia. Mark was drugged through the streets of Alexandria by a team of horses because he kept proclaiming Jesus to the people there. Thomas was stabbed with a spear in India because he couldn't stop preaching the gospel to those who didn't know Jesus there. Peter was crucified upside down in Rome for his profession. James was beheaded in Jerusalem because he wouldn't stop telling angry Jews that Jesus died for them. Bartholomew was flayed to death with a whip in Asia. You see, the concern, the deep, passionate concern for the glory of God, the passionate concern for the salvation of other people, it captured these men. Men like this changed the world. Men like this changed the world. They are moved along, they are carried along by gospel imperatives that have sunk so deeply into their hearts that it changes the way they see everything and everybody. These men died because their concern for the world was so great they'd rather die than be silent. It doesn't take much to shut me up. Somebody says, I'm not interested. And these men they couldn't shut up. They had news to a dying world. I think a lot has to be done in us if we're able to model this for other people. For us to love people so much that we're willing to risk our reputations. That we're willing to be thought of as crazy people. I think a lot has to be done in us if we're to model this for others. The last thing that I want to show in this text that was replicated from Paul to Timothy and Epaphroditus, his work ethic. His work ethic. Paul's work ethic in the gospel has been replicated in his protégés. In verse 22 of chapter 2, he says about Timothy, but you know Timothy's proven worth, how as a son with a father he has served with me in the gospel. Paul says, I haven't been doing this alone. I haven't been giving myself up alone. Timothy's been there with me every step of the way. He has poured himself out the way I've poured myself out. He's expended himself. He's given everything. He's exhausted himself for the work of the gospel. You've seen his proven worth. And then for Epaphroditus, a man who's willing to die for the work of Christ, risking his life to serve. Paul's work ethic has been replicated in his protégés. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 10, Paul says this, but by the grace of God I am what I am, and his grace toward me was not in vain. On the contrary, I worked harder than any of them. Paul is not boasting. It may sound like it. He says, I worked harder than any of them, though it was not I, but the grace of God that is with me. Paul could say, I've given everything. I've worked hard. I've expended myself. I've given myself completely and totally to the task of making disciples. Paul's not boasting. He's stating a fact. He's left everything on the field. He's left everything on the field. 1 Timothy 4, verse 15, Paul tells Timothy this, practice these things, immerse yourself in them, so that all may see your progress. Work hard, Timothy. Give it everything you've got. Leave it all on the field. And they've seen Paul. Timothy and Epaphroditus have seen Paul immersed in the work. You know, we talk a lot about balance these days. We talk a lot about balance these days. I wonder about this concept sometimes. I wonder if it's biblical. I wonder if it's biblical, at least in the way we define it. Make sure that enough time is given to here and here and here. And don't overextend yourself anywhere. Don't be tired. You need to make sure that you Sabbath enough and you rest enough and take care of you, you know. Make sure that you're living balanced and that everything is taken care of. When I read the story of Paul, when I see Timothy, when I see Peter, when I see Mark and Luke, when I see these individuals, I see them leaving it all on the field. That doesn't look like balance the way we would usually define it. They've poured themselves out. Now, I don't mean to say that we are robbing in areas where we must and are called to be responsible as parents, that we would give time to our children and we would lovingly shepherd them well. But I think sometimes we're so concerned about having balance achieved everywhere that we never really give ourselves to anything. We never really pour ourselves out anywhere. Well, we need to make sure that we have enough time for all of these things and that everything is equally balanced out. If the example of these men who changed the world is what we should be looking to, then maybe balance as the world defines it is not what we should be looking to. He gave everything he had to the work of the gospel. He could say at the end or he could say in Philippians that he had poured himself out as a drink offering. That doesn't sound like balance. That sounds like exhaustion. It sounds like completely expending yourself for this cause that is higher than any other cause. That we might lead people to a place where they might willingly bow their knees and confess with their mouths that Jesus Christ is Lord. That task, getting people to that point, living an example to get people to that place, that should be the driving ambition of our lives. And I'm convinced that quite often it's not. It's not for me. I'm too concerned about living balanced to really pour it out. If others were mirroring your example, would they be leaving it all on the field? Or struggling to find balance? Would we see people who are busy with life or busy applying the gospel to all of life if people were mirroring our examples? Would we see people who are easily angered, frustrated and complaining? Think about it. If you had a mirror image right now, what would they be doing? What would their chief concerns in life be? If they were just like you, what would they be talking about? What would they care about? I think the truth is that we've all failed in many, many ways to be about the work of Jesus in the world. I think we can look at the past week and say, I missed one appointment after another that God had given me to share the gospel with clarity, with somebody I work with somebody I live next to, with somebody I recreate with. I think we can find many, many failures. So this morning I'm incredibly thankful for the cross where Jesus took all of my failures. I'm incredibly thankful for the cross that I don't have to carry the guilt and shame of my sin because Jesus carried it on the cross. When I see my failures, it causes me to look to Jesus so much more longingly. I'm thankful that his work of perfect obedience to God's mission is attributed to my account. When God looks at me, he sees the guy who's always on mission. When God looks at me, he sees the guy who doesn't fail in these appointments. When God looks at me, he sees the perfect missionary righteousness of his Son, Jesus Christ, perfectly expending himself to the point of death for me. God sees that in me. It's not actually the truth about me, but it's what's been declared over me. And so a message like this can feel so incredibly heavy because we're not living like that. We're not making disciples like that. We're not influencing others like that. We don't have that kind of concern for people. We don't have that kind of work ethic. We're not leaving it all on the field. And it could be crushing if we were left with that. But I have to leave you this morning with the gospel that Jesus took the crushing blow for you, that your failures deserve. And his righteousness, his missionary righteousness, has been attributed to our accounts through faith if we are in Christ. I'm also thankful, though, I'm also thankful for His resurrection because I am now empowered to be and do all that God has called me to be and do. I've been empowered. The resurrection power of Jesus Christ, the power that took His lifeless body out of the grave and walked out of an empty tomb to live forever, eternally, on high with power, is mine, enabling me to live the way He's called me to live. He is enabling me to leave it all on the field. He is enabling me to live with a passionate concern for my neighbors, laying up awake at night thinking about their eternal souls. I'm enabled to have this kind of concern for the people in my life. I'm enabled to leave it all on the field. I'm enabled to live selflessly, giving myself up for the welfare of others because Jesus is alive. And His power enables me. He is empowering us to live selfless lives of passionate love for others so that we work ourselves out of balance. Maybe our great ambition here should be to work ourselves out of balance for the cause of the gospel and the fame of Jesus Christ. We've got a long way to go. But we can get there, can't we? If Jesus is alive, we can get there. And He is taking us there. He's taking us to a position that other people would call radical. Man, that guy's, he's just too radical for me. I'm pretty convinced that's what almost everybody said about Paul. And certainly what they said about Jesus. I'm pretty certain it's what they said about Timothy and Epaphroditus, a man who's willing to risk his life because of his concern for others. Because Jesus is alive and His Spirit has been poured out in the church, we can be obedient to God's will for us. Let's pray. Father, we come to You this morning, and God, we thank You that what we needed but couldn't produce, You've provided through Jesus.